Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Today we're going to be talking about the quadratic formula, what it is, how we're going to use it to solve quadratic equations or equations where we have a term that's x squared x and a number equal to 0. So far with quadratic equations, we've learned how to solve them by factoring. We've learned how to solve them by taking the square root with all those imaginary numbers. And then we just learned how to solve by completing the square. So this is the fourth way in which you can solve those equations, the equations that are of the form, when we say quadratic, they're of the form ax squared plus bx plus c equal to 0, where we have an x squared term, an x term, and usually a number set equal to 0. So we're going to figure out how to use this formula in order to help us solve those types of equations. What you're going to need today is a pen or a pencil, your notebook and your foldable, and then most definitely a calculator. We're going to need that calculator today. So a long time ago, people only knew how to solve using the three things which we've already learned: factoring, square roots, or completing the square. So some people gathered around a table and thought to themselves and talked about how completing the square was so repetitive and so annoying, and we just needed a better way. And there's probably a formula that we could make out of this. And that formula is the quadratic formula. So some people sat around a table and hated all the different ways we know how to solve and came up with this formula. So the quadratic formula is x is equal to negative b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. So this equation is going to give me the two solutions that I need for this equation, for a quadratic equation. So make sure when I have this pencil on the screen, I want you to be writing what's in red. So everything that's in red, you should be writing that on your foldable. So it gives us the two solutions for these types of equations, and the radicand, or the thing under the radical, b squared minus 4ac, that tells me about about my solutions. What kind of solutions am I going to have? Sorry, we always know we're going to have two solutions, but whatever this number is under the parentheses, that tells me if it's going to be real, imaginary, or irrational. Okay, so if it's real, it's going to be a positive number underneath the square root. And if it's imaginary, then it's going to be a negative number underneath the square root, and so forth. So when it comes to completing the square, this formula is a formula in order to use it. It just doesn't show all the steps that are being shown like we've done in the past. But this formula is going to come in super helpful. So if we can't factor, if we can't just take it by solving by taking the square root, and if we don't want to complete the square, not that we can't, but if we don't want to because it's going to get us a yucky number, now would be the time to use the quadratic formula. So we have three examples that we're going to go through today. So these examples should be in your foldable, so follow along with the work. So using this formula, if you don't remember what the formula is, you have to reference it. It should be negative b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. So my a in this equation is that guy, which is a 1. This is my b, and then this is my c. So negative b, so x is going to be equal to a negative 2 plus or minus the square root of 2 squared minus 4 times a, which is 1, times c, which is a negative 8, all over 2 times a. So let's simplify what's in the underneath the radical first. So we have negative 2 plus or minus the square root of 2 squared is 4 minus, we have negative 4 times 1 times a negative 8, so that's actually going to turn to a positive 32 all over 2. 2 times 1 is 2. So keep simplifying. 4 plus 32 is 36 all over 2. And the square root of 36 is a perfect square, so the square root of that is just 6. So we're left with negative 2 plus or minus 6 all over 2. Now in this answer so far, there's no I anywhere. So that means that these are all real numbers and I can keep simplifying. So I just need to break this up into my two answers. So we have negative 2 plus 6 divided by 2, and we have negative 2 minus 6 divided by 2. I'm just breaking up this plus or minus symbol, okay? So negative 2 plus 6 is negative 4 divided by 2 is negative 2. Negative 2 minus 6 is a negative 8 divided by 2 is a negative 4. So we get x is equal to a negative 2 and x is equal to a negative 4. So that's how we use this formula, and that is example 1. Let's go on to example 2. All right, here's our formula, and we need to figure out what a, b, and c are. So a is 1 again, b is negative 6, and c is 7. So we need to plug all those numbers into our formula. So we have negative b, so if b is negative 6 and we need to negate it, that's going to turn it to a positive 6, plus or minus the square root of negative 6 squared minus, sorry, that's a 6, minus 4 times a times c, and a was 1 and c was 7, all over 2 times a, which is 1. So x is equal to 6, plus or minus, let's simplify what's underneath the radical. A negative 6 squared is a negative 6 times negative 6, so that's going to get back to a positive 36. And now we have minus 4 times 1 times 7, and 4 times 7 is 28. Sorry, that took me a second. All over 2 times 1, which is 2. And 36 minus 28, that's the next thing that we need to simplify in my next step. Sorry, I got ahead of myself. So we have 6 plus or minus. We need to take 36 minus 28. That's going to be 8 all over 2. So we can break down the square root of 8 to simplify that radical. So let's break down the square root of 8. Square root of 8 can be broken down into the square root of 4 and the square root of 2. So we have 6 plus or minus all over 2. And what I'm trying to do is break down the square root of 8 so I can put that in my next problem or my next step. So the square root of 4 times the square root of 2 can get me back to the square root of 8. That's all the stuff in blue. But we know that the square root of 4 is 2, and we can't simplify the square root of 2. So that's how we broke down that radical, because 8 wasn't a perfect square, but we knew we could break it down into a simpler radical. So now we need to split up our two possible answers, because we have 6 plus the 2 times the square root of 2 over 2 and 6 minus. So we need to split that up for our two answers. So we have 6 plus 2 times the square root of 2 all over 2. And then we have 6 minus 2 times the square root of 2 all over 2. So just like you learned in Algebra 1 and in geometry, when you have a number like 6 and a number like 2 times the square root of 2, those things are not like terms because the 6 doesn't have a radical with it. So we can't add that together. But we do know that 6 is getting divided by 2, and 2 times the square root of 2 is getting divided by 2. Sorry, my 6 looks like a B. That's a 6. We can break that fraction up. We're saying the first part, 6, is getting divided by 2, and the second part, 2 times the square root of 2, is getting divided by 2. So 6 divided by 2 is 3, and 2 divided by 2, that's just going to cancel into 1 square root of 2. So one of my solutions is x is equal to 3 plus the square root of 2. And then we can do the same, but now we just have a different sign. We're saying 6 divided by 2 minus 2 square roots of 2 divided by 2. So now we have x is equal to 6 divided by 2 is 3. These cancel, and now we just have minus the square root of 2. So those are my two solutions for that one. All right, there's my quadratic formula. In order to plug in A, B, and C, we have to have it in the generic form. In order to know what A x squared plus bx plus c is, we have to get that one side equal to 0, which is standard form, okay? So that means that we're going to have to add the 2 and add the 7 to the other side. So we have x squared plus 2x plus 7 is equal to 0. And it's from here that we know A is 1, B is 2, B is 2, and C is 7. So you can't figure out what A, B, and C are until you get it into the standard form. Otherwise, you're going to get the wrong answer from the quadratic formula, okay? So now we plug in our A, B, and C. So we get x is equal to a negative 2 plus or minus the square root of 2 squared minus 4 times A, which is 1, times C, which is 7, all over 2 times A, which is 1. So let's simplify. Negative 2 plus or minus the square root of 4 minus 28 all over 2. Now we can subtract 4 minus 28 underneath that square root. Keep simplifying. So 4 minus 28 is a negative 24 all over the square root of 2. So 24, the square root of 24 is not a perfect square, and we have this negative underneath the square root, which means that we're going to have to break up that radical, and we're going to have an imaginary, right? So we know that the square root of negative 1 is going to become I, from what we learned previously, and then the square root of 24, 24 has a perfect square of 4. So 24 has a perfect square of 4, and then 6 is the other factors because 4 times 6 gets back to 24, and we know that 4 is the perfect square that we need to break it down in. So my new answer, sorry, not my new answer, my simplified answer, if we were to keep this going, so I'm going to continue my work up here, we get x is equal to negative 2 plus or minus all over 2. So we're going to get the square root of 4, which is 2. Then we have I, right, left with the square root of 6. So we need to break that up into our two solutions. We have negative 2 plus 2i times the square root of 6 over 2, and then negative 2 minus plus 2i square root of 6 all over 2. I'm just breaking that into my two solutions. Negative 2 minus 2i square root of 6 all over 2. Okay, and so just like on example 2 from these slides, we can just divide negative 2 divided by 2. Those are going to cancel to a negative 1. Plus, if we take 2i divided by 2, that's going to leave me with 1i times the square root of 6. So that is one of my solutions. And now the same for the negative version of my answer. So this cancels to 1, so we get negative 1 minus 2's cancel, I times the square root of 6. And that is my other solution. So my two solutions are negative 1 plus I times the square root of 6 and negative 1 minus I times the square root of 6. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. I know this video was a little bit longer, but I want to thank you for taking good notes, and I shall see you soon.